OverSoul 7 and the Museum of Time by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John. Chapter 13, A Complicated Out-of-Body Experience and a Full House. While George Bainbridge III slept and Seven talked to Window and Diggs in the 20th century kitchen, George Bainbridge I sat in his red silk dressing gown on the side of his cot, looking out the attic window at the carriage house and drive and lawn below. His mind felt deliciously clear and unruffled, as still, he thought, as the June night sky, whose moonlight illuminated the scene outside his window with such delicate artistry. He was trying to get out of his body. "It's 1892, he told himself, and no matter how definite and authoritative that date sounded to him, no matter how perfectly his sense data confirmed it, he had tried to realize that other times, other years, seasons, and even centuries somehow coincided in this moment. He had learned that much. And he reminded himself, no matter that his wife and son would be home in a short week from Europe, he had to understand that the remaining time could be as lengthy as he wanted, despite the fact that when they returned, his experiments would be drastically reduced, if not entirely curtailed. The thought reminded him of the distractions he had to avoid. He had to keep a clear, open mental focus. Forget everything but this present moment as you experience it, he told himself. He stared gently out the window. He watched the white lace curtain move softly in the night June air. He watched the moonlight blink and tremble on the back hitching post and on the dark leaves of the lilac bushes, and George frowned and nervously twirled the edges of his fine mustache. Everything was quiet, yet he felt things stirring beneath it all. He stared at the roll-top desk in the corner, or rather, he stared at where he knew it was, for it was mostly invisible in the darkness. His journal was in the desk drawer. He wanted to make some notations, and yet he didn't want to move, lest he break the spell that he was trying to get himself into. It seemed that the soft air pulsated with urgency, as if there was something he was supposed to do, and he had no idea what it could be. Patiently and stubbornly, he tried another tactic, one that often worked. He'd largely given up sniffing laughing gas ever since he discovered that he could do things with his consciousness without it and control events better besides. So now he tried to get out of his body using what he called Method 1. He lay down, relaxed himself completely, closed his eyes, and felt around inside himself for what he called the invisible muscles of his astral body. Then he tried to sit up, while his body lay still, to move inner arms while his physical ones lay crossed on his chest, to walk on astral legs while his physical ones lay flat against the bed. "Ugh!" He groaned with the effort. The sound was like thunder. His body shuddered. "Thunder Nation!" he cried, realizing that he'd used too much effort, tried too hard. Now he'd have to start all over again. At the same time, he was growing sleepy. He yawned, annoyed with himself. Then another idea came to him. He'd use Method 5, if he could remember it. He'd use his own sleepiness to advantage. Usually George Bainbridge was all for the importance of willpower, resolution, and effort. He was learning, though, that sometimes these got in the way of his very special mental activities. So now, grudgingly, he gave in and tried a method of getting out of his body that took full advantage, or so it seemed to him, of the body's slavish need for sleep. He let his sleepiness come on. Trickily, he courted it. He yawned deeply, as if to tempt sleep to come closer. His eyes were closed, his bony body heavy on the cot's surface. He let sleep come on, let sleep have its way, and this was the trick. At the same time he conjured up an image of himself in the hall outside his room. When he fell asleep, at that very precise moment, just before his consciousness went under, he transferred it and himself to that other waking image. His breathing was getting deeper. Was it time yet? His mind was getting wavery, yet it was still too alert. Just a touch of wakefulness of the wrong kind. His breathing was even deeper and deeper. He was so near sleep. Yet at the same time, craftily, he held the image of himself intact in his mind's eye. He mentally watched it. It was perfect. Thinning brown hair, hawk-like nose, red dressing gown. He avoided getting sidetracked by details, though, and felt his consciousness gently begin a rolling motion that by now he learned to recognize. It was as if his consciousness were about to roll off a hill into sleep's oblivion. And just when he got that feeling, George, "Eureka!" he shouted mentally, rolled his consciousness into the image in which he was now fully awake. He congratulated himself and avoided the temptation to go back and look at his body, because sometimes when he did, he just fell right back into it, so to speak, and that was that. Now then, what now? He mused, listening and watching. Was everything as it should be? It was still night. He was still in the hall, so he went down to the second floor. What a delicious secret triumph, to be walking around out of his body. George thought of indulging in his favorite sport, walking or flying around the block at night out of his body. The only thing that stopped him was that once he went through the front door, the outside environment frequently changed. And then he had to be very alert and in good shape to handle the situation. As he mused, he walked down the hall of the second floor and paused. The bedroom doors were closed. Suddenly he knew that he wasn't alone. Cautiously, George Bainbridge walked through the first door into the western bedroom. The moon shone through the window, and George noted several things at once. The familiar bedroom furniture was gone. The gas lamps were gone from the walls, and lamps without wicks sat on the bedside tables. Now what was going on? George wondered. Excited, he bent down to get a closer look. Wires running from the lamps led to an outlet of some kind in the baseboards. He had to be in the future. These must be future electric lights, amplifications of the simple models he'd read of in his journals. What a boon to dentistry! He almost chortled, yet at the same time he knew that if he got too excited he might lose control and be swept back to his body. Was this his house in the future? Then who was sleeping in the bed that stood where his own should be? He bent closer. The moonlight shone on a man's face, and George Bainbridge stared. There was definitely a family resemblance. This man looked more like him than his own son did. Zounds! He bent closer. Too late he noticed the wires leading from the light blanket. He touched the blanket gently. Tiny shocks went through him, and the shocks were somehow translated into those weird crackling sounds that he found so curious. There must be electricity in the blanket? In his consternation, George swore. But if he was out of his body, why should electricity bother him, if that was electricity? His consciousness started to stray. The scene began to get dim. In desperation, George concentrated on the bedside table in front of his eyes, trying to keep it in focus. The smell of the late lilacs rushed up from the yard. The bedside table became increasingly visible. Then George heard a strange buzzing in his ears, or the sound of fire crackling, and suddenly a dizzying shift in his consciousness almost made him stagger. He felt as if he were flying through immense distances, even though he could plainly see that he hadn't moved an inch. This time George's excitement nearly did sweep him back to his body, but his curiosity was even stronger. It kept him rooted to the spot, though for a moment his consciousness twanged like a rubber band, trying to be snapped in two places at once. The room was the same, but again the furniture was different. Soft lights emerged from the ceiling, though George couldn't see their source. A group of people, looking as if they were on a tour, stood looking at the room in which he stood. There were oohs and ahs, but no one saw him. Was he hallucinating all this? George wondered. Let all hallucinations vanish, he commanded mentally, with more confidence than he felt. Nothing happened. George gasped. If he was right, then the people and room would have vanished if he were creating them himself. So he must have outdone himself. But where was he, and what was going on? A voice came out of the walls, and George leapt back. This is a replica of the George's bedroom, containing artifact copies found or reconstructed from the original tell. The exact age is uncertain, but certainly these furnishings were in vogue before the mid-1900s. You'll notice the ancient electric blanket, of course, plugged into wall sockets. Lamps that were turned off and on by hand. This was the most vivid out-of-body experience George had ever had. He was jubilant. He tried to see and hear everything he could, for later notation in his journal. At the same time, the clarity of the affair frightened him, too. Everything was almost too clear. Suppose he couldn't get back. But before he could really worry about that, George noticed something else that shocked him to the core. The visitors, or whoever they were, men and women alike, wore short, colorful tunics, with bare arms and legs everywhere flashing, and no one showed the slightest embarrassment. For a moment he wondered if he'd somehow traveled to some weird brothel. But no, the visitors obviously were staring at the room as if it were a museum piece. The invisible voice went on, "Who knows how many evenings the George spent back in those ancient times, experimenting with various states of consciousness until finally he came upon the codicils. And without the codicils, our world surely would not exist. Mankind's beliefs to that point were so self-destructive that only annihilation could have resulted." The George? George felt dizzy again, and when he heard the word codicils, more shocks went through his dream body. Every portion of his consciousness became super alert. The word seemed to fill his mind. Codicils. More crackling sounds. Darkness, light. Then darkness. The next thing George knew, he snapped back to his body. Physically he was shouting, "The codicils! The codicils!" The sound of his own voice was so loud that it frightened him. He looked around and checked the clock. It was 11 p.m. He was wide awake, and more excited than he could remember being in years. Quickly he put on his slippers, went out into the hall and down to the second floor. He opened the door to the western bedroom. Everything was the way it should be. His familiar bed sat there, empty. The glass lamps were in their accustomed places on the wall. He stroked his mustache and sighed. "Maybe the house is haunted," he thought. George Bainbridge III was thinking exactly the same thing as his grandfather closed the door. George woke up with his scalp prickling. He shook his head, bemused. Could have sworn that someone was in the room for a minute. Shit. He sat up, turned off the electric blanket, which was set at its lowest summer temperature because the old house got damp even on the warmest nights, put his pants on over his naked body, plunged his feet into his shoes, and headed for the kitchen. He'd never experienced a crazier week in his life, he thought. He wished Jean and the kids were back so that life could become commonplace again. The light was on. George heard voices. Shit again, he thought. All he wanted was a sandwich and a moment's peace, and instead 7 must be talking to that damn window, because now he heard voices clearly. "What's going on down here?" he called, with joking peevishness, as he approached the kitchen door. End chapter 13. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.